All right, I'll go ahead and start. We're looking at the peer development patterns in S3 today. And I'm going to start with this sort of 10,000 foot overview. It's a series of four patterns, and they are supposed to be able to stand independently, and to some degree they do, but they're really powerful together. And they speak exactly to what Randall was just bringing up about autonomy. The green line here traces sort of an autonomy DNA through this set of patterns. And the basic idea is that S3 is giving you personal autonomy through a lot of different methods and a lot of different patterns. And this autonomy supports your ability to change the structure around you to meet your needs. As we go through these patterns, we're going to start here with ask for help. They describe that as a simple protocol for learning, skill sharing, and building connections that respects other people's agency. Agency, of course, is another way of approaching the concept of autonomy. And this is the pattern we'll be covering today. It's, in my opinion, one of the most elegant and beautiful patterns within S3. It reaches out into every aspect of life if you allow it to, and addresses many of the blockers we feel when we're in collaborative environments. This process of asking for help can lead to this new pattern of peer feedback, which is just a very specific way of asking for help. In this, you invite any member of your organization, that could also be your team, to give you some constructive feedback on your performance in a role or in a team, and about your general participation and contribution, or any other area that you wish to develop. This is still inward looking. You're, as a peer, you're reaching out to the other people in your organization with a specific request for help with something. You want to be clear about the performance of your role. You want to be clear about what your role's objectives are within the domain. This leads to the pattern of peer review. And peer review is sort of like the grammar and syntax of how do you do peer feedback. It's a detailed process. Like a lot of S3 processes, it's got a few nested recursive elements to it that allow you to introduce some of the rational decision making and navigate by tension type patterns that we've learned before. But this is about formalizing a language around peer review. And this is a really important part of it. And it feeds into what we're learning about pattern language with collaborative sparks. And some other work that we're doing. And that peer review has a very specific stage in it called co-create a development plan. And the final pattern within peer development is a description, a formal description of a development plan, a plan for how to develop more effective ways of accounting for a domain agreed between delegator and delegatee. This is interesting. We started with a process of here's how I personally want to get feedback and work on my role, work on the stuff I'm doing, and see how it's affecting others and see what they think of it. But you end with a formalized document that goes to governance with the intent of changing the structure around you. That may be changing the role that you have, the description of the role. It could be changing the domain or the description of the domain, but it arises from the needs of the people who are asking for help. And from that, you get structural change that supports further autonomy. We're in a loop of our autonomy changes the structure that we're in, which gives us autonomy to change the structure that we're in. And this is how you go from coercive systems to systems that meet your needs, meet you where you're at, and can be actually co-created and co-developed. That is the
Can I
yeah,
jump
go
in very?
ahead.
Uh, this thing you just said about the is it a development plan for an individual or is it a development plan for a domain? There's a really strong cross link back to something we discovered last time,
Yes.
where a role is nothing different from a domain. It just
Yep.
happens that there's a person um,
Yep.
that's holding
A
that,
domain of one, a domain of
right?
one. Yep.
Yeah, yeah.
Yep. And that's the idea. This is what's so elegant about this set of patterns. It's not about changing people. It's about people adopting tools in groups. And we'll look at, when we look at this next pattern, as we go into the introduction, we'll look at why this is. But this is people asking other people to help them create the structures that you share and the resources that you share in order to help them grow, in order to help them meet their needs, which is a process of growth. So a development plan, interesting, even though it's informed, see, consider standard performance review. Like, you're not doing this well enough. Your peers think that you are not working well enough in this area. We'd like you to develop yourself. Here's a class you can take. Here's a seminar you can attend. Develop yourself, improve your abilities, go learn, come back to us as a better peer and able to perform better within our system. The development plan, this approach through peer feedback in S3, does not treat it like that. They treat it like you don't need to change, but we understand that you're here in order to grow. Your growth can only happen if our structure allows for it. So how can we change to help you grow? We'll get into where this comes from. It's a really deep research area, but it's such an important part of it. This is not coercive. It's not a power over situation where you're telling people they need to improve. You're telling people they need to do better. People are coming to you with their requests of, I need this to grow. I need this to improve. And the group as a whole, through consent and some of the other mechanisms within S3 operations and organization, governance, will address their structures in a way that meets those needs. So that is the 10,000-foot view. And I'll just jump in here. This is for, anybody viewing this that it doesn't have our familiarity with bouncing in and out of these patterns and finding them and stuff. But my first question here is, where can we find S3 peer development patterns? You can find them in the practical guide. There's a link to it there. The practical guide, like the way I approach it, the way I use it, I think of it as a roughly linear list of all the patterns in S3. So it's 79 or so patterns, I think. And at the top of this list are going to be foundational patterns, abstract patterns, the things that you can build on. Once you've sort of established your practices there, you can build on that and work your way to the bottom of the list, where the patterns become more concrete and are more dependent upon the foundation being set up. You can adopt any of these patterns in any order. If you adopt these ones at the bottom of the list, they're powerful in and of themselves. But if you've done the foundational stuff, like establish drivers, establish domains, describe them well, go through the evolving process to understand them better, patterns for organizing work, like pull systems, different types of meeting practices, those will be much more powerful patterns. So likewise, you don't have to develop those types of downstream patterns for meetings and work. You can just adopt domains and drivers and whatnot. But domains and drivers are much more effective if you have these downstream patterns to go to eventually. So that's how I think of this practical guide in terms of laying out the patterns. And we can see that peer development, it sits, so that creates sort of a logical order to it. It's not necessarily straightforward, it's a little complex. But peer development sits between evolving organizations and the enablers of co-creation, one of which we've already visited with artful participation. Peer development is very closely related to these. These are sort of its sibling pattern topics. So you'll find that evolving organization topics you can derive peer development from those patterns. And you'll find that enablers of co-creation perform much better when you have a peer development process in place. Likewise, you can find the peer development patterns in the pattern map. We're all familiar with this. It's got its own little space down here. And finally, you can find it in the common sense framework. I'm still figuring out just when and how you would choose to use the common sense framework. But the peer development patterns, not all of them are here. Ask for help is not specifically listed, although we'll find that it's implicit in the other three patterns in peer development. But all of the peer development patterns are in one area of the circle, which is this transformation area of the circle. And it's specifically within the principle that's labeled invest in learning. Is there any questions about where peer development sits in the broader ecosystem of S3. In the absence of any questions, I'll point out, do a quick little zoom in here. We see that in Invest in Learning, that peer review sits alongside a couple of other patterns. These are patterns that work well with it. One is evaluate meetings. That's a very far downstream pattern that assumes that you also have patterns and protocols for your meetings. We won't really worry about this one today. Navigate via attention. This is one of those super patterns that is in every area of the circle. So we also don't necessarily need to think of this specifically. And so it's interesting to me that peer development is really the lion's share of the idea of investing in learning. And for me, that pulls out a key concept of learning and education as something to think about when it comes to peer review. If we look at the other elements of the transformation circle, we see that we've got intentionally developing culture, and these are the patterns that belong in it. I've kind of divided them up a little bit to show the categories that those patterns sit in. And you'll see the evolving organizations pattern is involved in both of them. You'll see that sense making and decision making makes up a large part of it. This is a lot of context creation. And you'll see that in defining agreements and evolving, that clarifying stuff also shows up with peer development. This is really about learning, clarifying, understanding, and making these agreements, which is at the heart of what we should take away from where it sits within this transformation circle. The key concepts I come away with are learning and education, this transformation and evolution, that's a very important one, agreements in general, and clarification as a constant outcome that you're looking for in practicing peer development. And when we talked about autonomy earlier, we noted that clarification of roles, of domains, of descriptions of things, that was one of the important outcomes that really does set S3 apart. With those key concepts in mind, I can jump to the first pattern, but I just want to do a quick aside into some background that like a rabbit hole that I went down, trying to kind of ground these ideas. There's kind of like Cardano, S3 has a really strong research background, really, really strong. It goes back into the 70s. It's particularly informed by a period in the mid 90s when adult education, how do adults learn and continue to learn throughout life, where the research in that area started to overlap with organizational research about why aren't our companies adapting? Why are we slow to pivot? Why are we unable to keep up with market sentiment or to change our products in viable ways? That eventually, we recognize that right away, that eventually becomes agility and lean and constraint theory. But those things are deeply rooted in the research that came out of adult education. How do adults learn? And when those two things meshed together, they became a new field of study that was organizational learning. And organizational learning has a key principle in it that is reflected deeply, in my opinion, in S3, which is that it's difficult to learn the more information and knowledge that you build up. Organizations, which are combinations of a lot of people, have a very hard time making what they know coherent across all people. And we can think of that as across all domains within that organization. The ability of that organization to get a coherent knowledge base is the same thing as the ability of an adult to continue to learn later on in life. So this organizational learning was a discovery that adults learn best in teams. They learn best when they're able to collaborate, when they're able to bounce ideas off other people, when they're able to get feedback. They need these things to break the bias of certainty that you get as a learner. Children don't have this problem as much because everything's very uncertain for them. But the older you get, the more you learn, the more structured your knowledge becomes, and you start needing other tools to break out of those patterns. I refer to it here as peer development kind of provided me an inroad to this rabbit hole through this process of flattening the organization by giving everybody voice. And this is important because this, I'll zoom in here. You don't need to read these papers, but these are the sort of the heart of the research that leads to S3. This is some of the most cited. Between these 6 papers, you're looking at probably tens of thousands of citations. This is the heart of the research that got built on, similar to like Cardano was built on a handful of extremely solid core papers like Ouroboros. So this is that equivalent here. And it all kind of leads up to this Senge paper in 2006, which is a really good book, where the conclusion they kind of came away with that was that structure becomes behavior. This was an important realization. This is the constant battle in, you might call it human psychology, of nature versus nurture, right? It's clear that behavior was a reason behind why structures would come up a certain way. But what they really were able to come away with was an objective grounding in the idea that your structure can inform your behaviors. This was not, we almost take that for granted, but this was not well known in the late 90s in terms of organizational learning. What they came away with in this paper, what this research kind of builds up to, and where S3 and Agile and Lean kind of take it from there, is that the structure that you need for transformative learning, for the ability for agility, for the ability for businesses to adapt, and for teams to adapt, was that you had to have an open and reflective structure. If you back up just a little bit, you can look at some of the patterns we're used to in S3, things like doing check-ins and doing rounds. These are balancing our use of voice, right? So we're flattening the structure by giving everybody voice, and then we're balancing it with what's the opposite of voice. It's going to be listening. So in any check-in round, you speak for 30 seconds, but you listen for 2 or 3 minutes. And there's a really good ratio that starts to appear there. And that pattern it's a blooming pattern. It starts to show up all over within S3. In sociocracy, generally, what you surface is that it has one rule in sociocracy, and that's that everybody gets to talk and everybody will listen respectfully. And there's an art to that, right? It's an art to speaking in a relevant way. It's an art to listen actually respectfully in a way that people feel heard. And all the other patterns, everything else, it just seems to be a build out of how to support the ability to do this, to talk and have everybody get that chance for generative engagement, but also to have people listen respectfully, which is how they grow, which is how they learn. The speaker's not going to learn. The speaker's sharing what they know. The people who are listening are going to learn. And this is how you start to build learning organizations. This is how you start to build agile organizations. I'll stop there for a second and just let anybody bring up anything that comes to them.
I love how deep S3 actually is. Like on the surface, it's like all these patterns. And if you don't know that they may seem kind of random or just put together. And now I know why it takes years for them to rev it with new learnings, because changing one pattern affects every other pattern in some way, and making sure all of that's coherent and follows their kind of structure and depth is really quite amazing when you start to dig into it. And I just wanted to also second that Senge book is really cool. And he's also been very influential on stuff like Theory U and some of the stuff that came out of there too.
I wonder how all these patterns sort of coalesce to enable artful participation. I'm kind of wondering, like, I understand creating that space for peer development and not, but what if an agent is just intentionally trying to be disruptive, or kind of coasting and not adopting the principles, but participating in any space, considering that the organization is expected to sort of, or maybe I'm understanding it wrong, sort of adapt around that person so that they can develop. I wonder if that, how does that happen? How does that peer review, peer feedback happen in a way that, does the behavior never needs to be corrected, or how do you measure if someone is bringing value to the space instead of just taking value but not providing value
Or
back?
taking space.
Sorry?
Or taking space.
Yeah, just I don't know. Like I can be somewhere and not really. I can just take up space. Yeah, I can take up space. I can just talk, and not really. Should the organization still try to adapt around me so that I can develop, or is there such a thing as calling out and not acting according to the principles, that there's sort of like an agreement between the group that are being adopted and being used? I don't know.
I think it's a really good question. It's I think we're going to address it a little bit today in the ask for help pattern, and I'm going to see if I can't spot it when it comes up. I hadn't thought about it from that angle, but I think I see where it connects. I will say that this idea of open and reflective structure is maybe like the reflective part is not something we've heard a lot. Open, obviously, we kind of understand that. That's the idea that that person you're referring to can be there, right? They can be there. They have permission to be there. That they're giving themselves that permission. That's what open means. It's their choice. The reflective part's a little bit different. It indicates self-reflection, like that's artful participation. Are you looking at your own participation? And reflective also means that the structure itself has to be reflective. It has to be able to look at what it's doing the same way that an individual can, and then change what it's doing. And that's where this peer development process comes in. It says this is the process of an organization being self-reflective. And it does it through the individual actions of its members being self-reflective. And artful participation is a follow-on pattern of peer development. It goes really well with it, but it comes after. You are most informed as an artful participant by the results of your organization's feedback and peer review processes. So you can be the best artful participant when you've got a good peer development process running in your organization. Without a good peer development process running, you may attempt to be a good artful participant, but it'll be much harder. You'll have to, I mean, in a way, you'll have to do these things just in a different way. You'll be meeting those needs outside of the structure of the organization. You'll be approaching people in real life events and saying, hey, what did you think of today? I like that meeting, because that space wasn't provided through the organizational, operational type parameters. But I think we'll touch on it a little bit and ask for help. And I'm really hoping that if what I remember is right about the presentation, I'm like a little bit unfocused here, but I think I know where it fits, and I think I'll be able to call it out when we get there. Anything else, or should we jump into ask for help? All right, cool. Let's move on. How are we doing for time?
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, well, I was right that we need more time. This is such an elegant. I don't want to do a disservice to this pattern. It's beautiful. It might, after investigating, it might be my favorite pattern. I hesitate to say that on the grounds that I'd probably say that after every pattern I investigate. So it's a simple protocol. This is all it is. This is all that S3 has to say about it in this white block. It's a simple protocol for learning, skill sharing, building connections with respect for people's agencies. There's two things going on in that statement. One is this is about you thinking about how you're going to grow, but this is also the fact you have to do this with others, right? This is a process we're even talking about because it's a collaborative process. You can do that on your own in a library somewhere if you want to, but we're talking about something different. We're talking about a group, a team, a role, the growth of an organization. It's a simple pattern. Ask, would you be willing to help me with X, Y, Z? And the person you have asked will either accept or decline with a simple yes or no. I've got a few rules here. If they decline the request, accept that answer. You don't negotiate. You don't inquire as to why they're saying no. If the request is unclear, you can ask for more information. If somebody's asking you to help, you can say, well, I need more information to know if I can help or not. And if you accept a request for help, follow through, support them in the best way that you can. I want to draw your attention first to these blue tabs up here. And remember that the key concepts that we pulled from where this pattern rests within the transformative framework of like their common sense framework, and that it's evolving agreements is one of these complementary patterns that we have. And we can think of all of our organizations, all of our teams, and even our roles that we establish for individuals as collections of agreements. Like atoms make up a body, agreements make up an organization. It's the constituent element. It's our monad. And all agreements can be seen as clarifications of a simple question: who is helping who with what? So when people work together, there's only two roles available. That's what this pattern is suggesting. There's the helper and there's the person being helped. And if you want to do this well, if you want to have good collaboration, first and most important thing you'll establish in any sort of structure is who's who. Who is the helped and who's the helper? We can understand these two roles through a question that they must maintain at all times in that role and a responsibility that they have within that role. The helped, the person who is asking for help, they need to clearly articulate their needs when they're trying to get somebody to help them, even if they don't initially know what those needs are. You can use the feedback of the person you're asking when they ask you to clarify this. What do you mean by that? What are you able to do with this? What resources can you provide for that? They have to communicate what help they need, and it needs to be accurate in order to prevent wasting people's effort, wasting people's time, ensuring that the people who are helping are able to fulfill their own needs. This is a reciprocal process. And that question that must be in their mind at all times is this helping? So somebody's offered to help me. Is it helping? This is really important. They're the only ones who know if it's helping. Person being helped. The person helping, they don't know if it's helping. Like, that's not something they will have the knowledge to know. Only the person being helped knows that. And they have a responsibility to clarify that and to be sure that they're letting their helper know. The helper has a responsibility that they have to understand what the person needs if they're offering to help. They have to see that person as another human being on the other side of that question. And they need to understand what they need. And that involves knowing who they are and what that person is trying to accomplish. And that's how you can offer to help. Their key question is going to be real simple. Am I helping? Does this help? Is what I am doing helping you? That's a question they'll be asking the whole time if you're the helper. And it highlights the importance of the actual help being authentic, genuine, and actually useful, right? Rather than just appearing useful, checking the boxes, filling out the time card. We know that there's benefit being had here. People are getting where they're trying to go. Successful collaboration hinges on both parties embracing these roles and communicating clearly. This is an assumption built in here that you have communication protocols, that you have candor. I think we're set up pretty good. We've got Discord. We can communicate anytime. We've got DM capabilities within that. We can communicate privately if we need to. And we have established candor over many, many meetings. So chances are these questions can be asked and answered if we've got those things in place. If you find you can't ask these questions, if you find you can't meet these responsibilities, you can look to the structure of the organization and say, can we help with that? Can we set up a Discord? Can we set up a channel for this operation? Can we set up a Google Doc where our thoughts can get recorded and people can visit them async, because that's one of our limiting factors. This is an example of how you can anticipate a development plan being able to come from the simple act of asking for help. Because even if at this stage you can't follow through, for the most part we do. But if you couldn't, that gives you a clue as to where you need to go from there. Your next big question could be a peer feedback question and say, hey, how come When I asked for help on this thing, nobody wanted to help. Like, what is that? Does nobody like me? That could be a problem. Is it that nobody's got the bandwidth? So, we've actually run across this already in some of our meetings. So you can see here is a set of patterns that can help you address that. The helped, finally, to get out of this slide, the helped must advocate for their needs, and the helper must actively listen and ensure their actions directly contribute to the desired outcome. That listening is coming up again. We're going to keep running into that. Listening is such an important skill in the most fundamental process of establishing an organization, which is forming agreements, with agreements fundamentally being these requests for help. An important concept that we need to understand is the idea of shared need. This is, I think, an advancement that S3 offers us. This isn't their language. This is me teasing this out of their pattern. But a shared need arises during collaboration when the assistance that someone requires aligns with what another person needs to accomplish. I don't know where source begins and S3 ends here, but this is an idea that comes up in source, that I'm sure comes up in ideas of working with source, which is that people need to do what they need to do, and you can't ask them to do things they don't need to do, because that isn't helpful for them, and it's not going to end up being helpful for you, even if they say yes. Okay. When it comes to this shared need for the helped, if they follow through with this idea, it would guarantee that they receive assistance from someone who is invested in the task, that has some stake in it, who essentially needs to get this task done. You asking them to help is synergistic and productive, and the relationship will be synergistic and production. It'll flow naturally. For the person who's helping, it ensures that if there's a shared need, that they are genuinely helping, right? It comes back to that authenticity part. They're not just checking a box for that person, and they're not filling a gap for that person that they themselves do not want to be filling. This is a hard thing to do well, and we'll get to that point, because there is like a mastery component to this. A brief aside to talk about a concept of the helpless. This is one of those constraints that is a blocker for being able to do this process of asking for help well. And it's that, for whatever reason, help is a challenging word. Asking for help is a challenging process. I was a foster parent for 15 years, and I received a lot of training and therapeutic processes for children. And this was something that came up a lot. The ability for people who feel helpless to reach out and ask for help. And just think of that word when I said helpless, and how it made you feel and what it made you think of. We don't want to be thought of as helpless. We don't want to think of ourselves that way. We don't want to take a earth bestriding hero entrepreneur and say, that person sure needs a lot of help. Look how many people are working for them. That's not how they see themselves, and that's not how culture wants to see them, as being somebody that can't do it without a lot of help. This is a really challenging, in my opinion, it's a stigma. It's something we have to overcome, our ability to ask for help when we need it. There's possibility it stems from our experiences in childhood. Like, it can go deeply, and not be an obvious thing to address in a check-in round or in a closeout. It prevents people from getting what they need when they need it, because of its blocking potential. And it also stops people who might want to help from throwing their hat into the ring on the grounds that they don't want to appear condescending. They don't want to make somebody else feel less than, because they understand that this process is in play and that it works. This reluctance to engage in helping behavior hinders collaboration across an organization. It hinders the ability to ask for help, to do this basic piece of a basic agreement. And it prevents everybody from getting where they need to go, because it prevents you from learning. There's a vulnerability that comes just in the act of being educated, of learning something new. We'll talk about that in a second. But I want to leave you with this thought that sometimes even uttering the words, I need help, can be so hard for people that they'd rather just not get any help. And that's, in a way, in just a very human way, it's unacceptable. Like, we shouldn't accept that from our friends. We shouldn't accept that in our relationships. We should be able to support each other in getting our needs met when we have the tools to help each other. I think I'll stop there for just 1 second before I kind of come to addressing that. Does anybody have any thoughts?
Just
Or any?
you probably have
Go ahead.
about 5 minutes to wrap this up.
Okay.
And Harsha's got his hand up.
So I was just curious if, I mean, it just sounded like it is more oriented towards the people who are asking for help. Um, I was just curious if there are any guidelines for like people asking for help as well. You know, I'm saying, like, it seems like a one-sided affair where there are expectations. So for someone who is helping, do they expect something in return, or is this more of like a, I'm a good person, I'm going to help everyone situation?
We will cover that a little bit. That's coming up in a slide.
If I need to help load the dishwasher, I can't also be told how to load the dishwasher. I'm just saying.
Yep. Yep. That's a core component of the idea that as a helper, you've got needs too. And a framework for recognizing that is an important part of being able to do this very fundamental step in any process of forming agreements, and using those agreements as something you can check in order to evolve an organization and get better structure that helps everybody and gets things built and gets things done and has impact. So this card is a follow-on from the idea of this helplessness and this inability to engage fundamentally in this first step of the process, by recognizing that you have to have some courage in order to be a helper or to be helped, both. And this is because, and you gain this courage just by simply recognizing that both helper and helped have a two-sided coin involved in this process, which is, on one side, they expose a vulnerability. On the other side, they take on a responsibility. The vulnerability puts them at risk. The responsibility gives them control over that risk. And it's reciprocal. The helper's vulnerability is helped by the responsibility of the helped. The helped's vulnerability is responded to by the responsibility of the helper. They fit together like a little puzzle when they're done well. For the helped, their vulnerability is that they have to admit they cannot do this by themselves. They do need to be able to trust somebody. They do need to be able to hand over part of their work or hand over some aspect of what they want to see happen. And they don't necessarily want to give up their vision, and they don't necessarily want to give up the control of that. But if you're going to be helped, you must, and you have to recognize that, and that's a vulnerability. Their responsibility is that they're the only ones that know what they need, the only ones that know if they're actually being helped. And that responsibility does give them a sort of creative authority over what they've delegated. For the helper, they have to realize, hey, I'm not in charge. And for some people, that's a release to say, hey, buck doesn't stop here. I know that. I just need to show up and do what I'm being asked to do. And I can't know if what I did was valuable. It's not up to me to make that decision. The person I'm helping, they're the ones who know, if I did a good enough job loading the dishwasher. But at the same time, for whatever you're responsible for, you have to trust or that you've been entrusted with. You have to know, you're the only one that knows if it aligns with your needs. So you are responsible for making that known. If somebody does try to say you have to do it this way when you load that dishwasher, you can say, look, I can't do it that way. That's not how I do it, but I'm happy to help. And I guarantee that when we get to the end, it's going to look like what you need.
The dishes
Those
will be clean. Yeah, that's the agreement.
dishes will be clean.
I don't know. I've seen some horrible dishwash loading. I just, like a raccoon on meth. Just half the dishes get left out. And I was gonna say, I just
Dishes. Clean
there
dishes.
needs to be some guards. There needs to be some rules, because my wife sometimes just that specific example. dishes get left out, and then it's work, whether, and if you are asking for help, but if you're expecting something from the help as well, right? You're expecting help. What if that help is creating work that you were expecting, like, this needs to help me, this needs to help me do this task. But if you are helping me, and if my wife hears me, she's going to kill me, but also creating work for me, that's not helping,
This is
right?
being recorded.
It's on record, man. Yeah, it's a good example of like, is it helping when they said, hey, I need help getting that dishwasher unloaded, and you say, oh, I'm there. Is it helping to completely reorganize how they put their dishes away in their kitchen so they can't find anything? Did that help? But that's maybe you thought it was better. It was a better way of laying out the kitchen. And you could even explain that to me. You could be like, hey, this is better for you. This is going to work out better. And they're still frustrated and they're still upset. And they're like, nah, I just wanted help unloading it. That's where I needed the help. And that's why, and these are hard, like, this is just it. We could bring any example into this because this is more than S3 and this is more than organizational learning. This is how you make the individual effort that we all put in to growing, being better, improving, advancing in our lives into a team environment, into a collaborative environment where we're all getting the benefits of our personal learning. This, I think it's why it's not included. This particular pattern is not included in the transformative circle of the common sense framework because it's so fundamental. You practice this in a different way than as an organization. You practice this as an individual and you master. This is like a thing that you master. And it's two things. You might be mastering the asking. How do you ask people for help with things? Or you might be mastering, how do you offer help? How do you offer to show up and be responsible for the things that are being entrusted to you? So I've got 2 slides for that, and that'll be, I think that closes us out. We've got the art of helping. This is for the people who want to help, who want to show up, who want to help other people fulfill their visions, to accomplish their goals, to build the thing that they're setting out to build. Only help when the work that you do to help is work that you need to do anyway. Not want to do, need to do. This is something you need to do. What does that mean? It means you understand your own needs. This is a responsibility you have as a helper. Only help people who need help, and only help them when they need that help. These little tabs here, these are conversations I have had with people. This is a hard art to master, and it's easy to fall into traps. You've got the trap of, hey, you look like you need help, I'll help. That is not helping people who need help, right? They have not made that clear. They have not expressed that need. It's a trap to say, this person needs help, but they don't need it now. Okay, so I was helping and they needed my help, but not now. That wasn't clear. This isn't helping. What if they need your help? They need it now, but it's not your help specifically that they want. That's a trap you can fall into and think that just because you can do the thing that they need your help. And it's exhausting trying to help somebody who doesn't need help. This is a dead end. This is one of those things that causes burnouts, especially in these decentralized type communities, helping people who don't need help. Or trying to help people who don't know what help that they need. And it's exhausting to help someone by doing something that you don't need to do. Any repressing or denying of your own needs to serve someone else's will burn you out faster than you can say burnout. This is a hard art to master. To help another human being, we actually have to understand another human being. What do you have to do to understand another human being? You've got to give them the space to speak, and you've got to listen when they speak. Just starting the work isn't going to be enough. And even doing what they say isn't enough. This isn't about they put out a command and you follow it. This is not the relationship that leads to beneficial activity. We have to use wisdom, and we have to use empathy, and we have to use compassion. And all of this is careful listening in order to understand, to the best of our ability, our personal ability, of what it is that they actually need. And then it gets really hard after that, because we also have to apply all of this to ourselves and understand what we really need to be good helpers. The art of being helped. If you're one of the people that needs to ask for help for something, you need to listen to yourself. Same as the person offering help needs to understand their own needs, you need to listen to yourself with a subtle intensity and establish with real clarity what it is you actually need, because this is what you will have to communicate. You have to ask for help often, and you have to ask for it clearly, and you can only accept that help from people who will actually benefit from helping you. How will you know if they'll actually benefit from helping you? You need to listen to them and understand what their needs are. There's some key concepts to keep in mind here. Only you know if the help is helping. It's your responsibility to explain what you really need. Are you okay with being somebody who needs help? It's easy for us to just show up and do things, but it's hard to say we need help, and it's hard to think of each other as they need my help or I need their help. It's hard to think of each other in this way without a lot of trust. It's tempting, this is the worst part of it. It's tempting to say, well, we can both decide what's needed. We're equals in this. We're co-creators. We'll both decide what we need to do. And this is a temptation because we get to pretend that we aren't responsible for our own needs. And we get to pretend that those needs do not make us vulnerable. And that there's no one that's just a helper. Like, that's just a nothing thing. We would never accuse somebody of just being a helper. But when you see the type of responsibility and vulnerability that a helper takes on, nobody is just a helper. It's very meaningful for somebody to take the time to listen to you and give you the feedback and the commitment to follow through on the things you're asking. That's a major ask. And for somebody to follow through on that is not a less than type of thing. Final thought. There is nothing more precious and powerful than the effortless flowing harmony of one person helping another in such a way that both of them get what they need out of that. So ask for help. That's absolutely one of the simplest patterns in S3. It's there's a couple of short, small ones in there. This is one of the shortest. And it's a pretty simple idea. Get help from people who want and need to help you. And that's the presentation. Little over time.